It's really just a way to kind of make sure the story doesn't languish and that it has to move along because there are some external forces on the story that are making things happen. So I think that's why, like, you see lots of stories that have to deal with an inheritance or going back to a small town or an orphan setting out to try to complete a quest, or where there's a lot of time restrictions built into those kind of things. And so I think it's really helpful in terms of the story not lagging along. When I'm reading a story that doesn't have a ticking time bomb, I'm like, oh, it's tough. Like, what are you doing to make sure that they don't have forever and a day to fix this problem?
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indy Author podcast, I talk with Jennifer Hilt about decoding storytelling tropes, including the universality of about 40 tropes across various genres, especially the tropes of found family, misdirection, secrets and scars, and the ticking time bomb. Jennifer shares insights about how tropes like these help shape narratives and character motivations, touching on examples from popular books and movies. And now let's hear from Jennifer Hilt about decoding storytelling tropes. Hello, and welcome to the Indy Author podcast. Today, my guest is Jennifer Hilt. Hey, Jen, how are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
I love to have you back. And Jen has made 3 previous guest appearances on the podcast. She was in episode 230, The Good, the Bad, and the Surprising of Kickstarter. That was with Megan Haskell. On episode 163, Year-End, The Writing Craft and the Publishing Voyage with Jennifer Hilt and Michael Laran. And way back in episode 140, Troping Your Way to a Stronger Story. And so because Jennifer is a 3-time past guest, we're going to dispense with the formal introduction, and I'm going to ask my new standard question of many-time guests, which is, what is something that our listeners and viewers might not know about you that you'd like to share with us?
I love that question, by the way. And I'm wondering, if I come on a 5th time, is it like Saturday Night Live where we get a jacket? So I think work on that.
That's what Dale Roberts always wants. He always wants me to send him a jacket.
That's really cool. You could send the same jacket and we could just all pass it around.
Okay. Yeah, I think that maybe you and Dale would need different sizes of jacket, but
Yeah, that
maybe
would
he'll
be
send around
funny.
the shawl.
Yes. That'd be funny if we had to all wear the same coat. Okay, one thing about me people might not know is I love to open water swim. And I'm not very good at it, but I really like it. And I'm able to swim in Lake Washington, and I usually only do it in the summer, even though there are people who swim year round. And then at the other parts of the year, I swim just in a pool, community pool. But I have gone to Turkey and to Bali to do like these, call it swim treks, where you like go and they take you out and you just like basically swim. And that's really pretty cool. I love the sense of like being very small in this very big. I love that kind of feeling of you're just like kind of insignificant in a way. I don't know. But it's just like this feeling of being in the water and that you're just like this little tiny visitor in this whole other universe. So that's kind of like a thing about me people might not know.
I did not know that about you. But, interestingly, I can totally empathize, not so much with the swimming part, but what you're describing is exactly why I like being out on a cruise ship where I can't see land. I love that sense.
And that makes me super nervous. And I don't like, the thing that helps me if I've been in that situation is that, I can always get in the water and swim, even though obviously it doesn't make a lot of logical sense. But that's really funny that being out, like being away from shore makes me anxious. But just if I'm in the water, it doesn't matter. So I don't know. It's really interesting how humans are. I don't know if it's a thing of, so are we people who we like a big pond versus a small pond? You know how there's those kind of ways of delineating people. So I don't know. But
well, I also like cozy spaces. So evidently I either like it enormously open like the Pacific, or I like to be like in a tiny reading nook.
Yeah, that's cool. I really love the marine life. That's the part there really wasn't much to see marine life wise in Turkey, but there was like amazing ruins underwater from all the earthquakes. But in Bali, they haven't had the overfishing problem that a lot of other places in the world have had. And it was like swimming in an aquarium. It was just amazing. So that was
my
great.
gosh. Yeah. So cool. Well, I'm going to start asking all my guests this question because
it's really interesting to hear what people say. And that's kind of questions.
Very cool. Well, we're going to go from small cozy spaces and open water swimming and the large Pacific to the topic for our conversation today. And Jennifer is the author of the Trope Thesaurus series, and I have my Trope Thesaurus right here. The now 5-book, I believe, Trope Thesaurus series. Is that right?
Yes, the mystery thriller will be the 5th one.
Cool. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about mystery and thriller tropes. And I'm hoping that in the process of this conversation, there's going to be obvious ties for people who write the books that would actually be shelved on mystery and thriller shelves. But I think there's going to be some opportunities for people who write different kinds of genre to also tap into this. So don't tune out if you're not a mystery or thriller writer.
Yeah.
And so just talk a little bit first about what got you interested specifically in, maybe more generally in tropes, but specifically in mystery and thriller tropes.
Well, first of all, I don't really think of mystery and thriller tropes necessarily as separate than tropes you would. I think that there's about 40 tropes that you can use in all different kinds of storytelling, and it's a matter of like how you apply them and what you pair them with. So it's not like I feel like, oh, for a mystery thriller, you need to learn these specific ones, which are totally different than like you would use in fantasy, sci-fi, or romance, or, just kind of a general fiction story. So I think that's one thing that I really like about tropes is that they have this kind of universal applicableness that then you can, like I said, depending on what you pair them with and what your genre expectations are, you get like a lot of cool things. So that's one thing I like is that I like it when you don't have to like, oh, I don't have to learn a whole different set of things. In general, I've always really enjoyed crime. Or I like that as a story vehicle. I do much better with stories where there's like a thing that's happening, a hunt, chase, as opposed to kind of like a meandering. Those are just not my kind of favorite stories personally. So mystery and thriller tropes, obviously lend themselves well to action and pursuit and justice and all these kind of things that to me make a story interesting. So I'm enjoying, as I'm starting to work on this book, being able to dig into those and think about those. And your comment about, even if you don't write mystery and thriller, I think you can, because there are still usually elements of crime and various other stories or motivation, those elements, even if you don't write those genres, there may be elements of those in your stories. So it can be helpful to just kind of think about what I'm saying. Yeah, that makes sense. No, that doesn't make sense. I don't agree with that. I'm going to do it this other way. Sometimes I feel like when I'm outside of the genre that I'm currently working on, it really helps to hear things from a different point of view. So that's just kind of like my little plug for that. So yeah, I just have always been a really big mystery reader, and way back to Sue Grafton, if you're old enough to remember, Sue Grafton and V.I. Warshawski. And those were kind of like, you remember, right, Maddie? Like at the time, they were like, female detective, what? Who's not like, it was like very much male-dominated stories, except for some Agatha Christie, I think. So it was really kind of neat to see those, and then we've had huge waves of it since then, so that isn't a big deal now, but I remember reading those at the time and just being like, the breath of fresh air of those was just really great, and seeing how those tropes even worked with it back then, although I didn't realize those were tropes.
Well, the conversation about maybe some things that were more groundbreaking and notable in the past makes me think of one of the things that I know you're interested in, which is the domestic thriller market. We're talking about tropes and themes that are common now. And you had called out Frida McFadden's The Housemaid. And I actually haven't read The Housemaid. So can you just give a little bit of background on how that plays into tropes and how that is playing out in other authors' books?
It's Frida McFadden wrote that book, I think 2 or 3 years ago now, and it's, I think, still like in the top 10 of all Amazon books. It's so incredibly popular. It's actually being made into a movie with Sydney Sweeney and Amanda Seyfried. I'm not sure how to say her last name. But anyway, it's basically what I think is interesting about it is it's a pretty straight up story of tropes in terms of it really just involves 3 people. A woman goes to work as basically a nanny / housemaid for a wealthy couple, and the wife appears to be the antagonist, and she has a very handsome husband. And this story is basically like how the relationship between those 3 people changes. It's just been crazy popular, and the domestic thriller market is nuts. If you look at, any kind of metric for that, it's really popular in indies. It's really popular in traditional books. There's a whole bunch of other authors too. That's just usually the one I mentioned because that, I don't know, this is kind of, I think like it gained a lot of traction for that. And so it's really interesting to me because I feel like it's a lot of the straight up application. It's a pretty straight up story in terms of these 3 people. And what really is the interesting part about it is kind of the twists or the unveiling or like the misdirection in terms of the secrets and scars and those kind of things. So, but I love that it's like in this domestic space because we haven't had, until this genre kind of really burst out, we didn't really have this as like a powerhouse genre. Although I think Gone Girl helped to kick it off.
Yeah.
And the book and the movie market for that. But it's really kind of neat to see, this kind of inter-family tension / violence. It's just it's interesting and it's very rich, and there's a lot of stuff you can mine for that. So I think that's why we're seeing that it's just so people literally can't seem to read those fast enough.
So when you were talking about the, let's say, 40 tropes that are not necessarily specific to certain genres, do you see examples of where a trope that would maybe be more associated with a domestic thriller is either showing up or could be worked into a book in a completely different genre?
Sure. I think the protagonist in The Maid is definitely like that prototypical loner / she basically operates as an orphan. And we see that in so many genres of this person kind of going in alone into a story, and then, all these things happening as they find their way. I think one of the reasons the domestic thriller genre is so popular is because it really plays with the idea of found family, and that's again a trope that we find in any kind of genre. But the easiest example, if you aren't super familiar with it, is kind of the idea of Guardians of the Galaxy, where this ragtag team forms this kind of group after they all seem like they don't get along and things. And so it's really interesting that we just kind of keep seeing different ways to play with found family. There's a straight up application of found family could be something we see in the Netflix and Hallmark Christmas romance movies, where somebody goes to a small town and everybody's really nice and they take the protagonist in and she discovers this hero and community and decides they never want to return to city. And that found family is just very structurally important and nurturing and all that kind of thing. And then you have things like in domestic thriller where people think they find those things, but it turns out to be not so good underneath, which is really kind of neat. So I think that those are tropes that we see again and again in all kinds of genres. And it's just kind of neat to see them used in different ways depending on what other elements they're with. So, but yeah, so those are some I see in domestic thriller that are really big deal. Also, there's always the forced proximity, which is, you could guess, is like a house or some kind of, domestic situation where they're on an island. Because there's lots of ones also I see that are on islands or not so much on boats, but, kind of those kind of things. So you really can't leave. So you see tropes kind of used that way too. So it's really just interesting to me how you can take something like that and then do different things with it, depending on how you want to paint it,
Yeah, well, I've been trying to be more aware of tropes in my own work. And I don't go into a work thinking, oh, now I want to write one about, forced proximity or whatever. And I think, as with so many things, it's much easier to find these things in other works than one's own work.
It is.
And
Yes.
one of the ways I've been using ChatGPT is to give it a PDF of my book and then say, I basically usually do this in the context of asking for a sales description. I'll say, please write a sales description for this book, emphasizing the tropes that would be appealing to readers. And found family is one that comes up a lot, especially for my Lizzie Ballard thrillers. And it was one of those ones that once the machine thought of it for me, I was like, oh yeah, of course. But I wouldn't have picked it out myself because I think we're too close to it to see those kinds of things.
Absolutely. That's a really great use for ChatGPT to do that, because it really is easier if somebody else can look at it than you, because you're used to it. I'm even like that with something I'm working on. I'm like, oh yeah, I didn't even realize that was in here and I've been working on this, But it's really hard because you're in one storytelling mode and then you're trying to get into another mode for how you're going to market it and think of how to position it and stuff like that. But yeah, it is pretty much everywhere and everything, because you think about it, it's all about community, So, and that's super important in stories. So.
Yeah, and I think it's also a good way to find comps that one might not think of for one's own books, because if once I realized that found family was very much a part of Lizzie Ballard books, then I could start looking at comps where found family was also very important. And they were sometimes things that didn't spring to mind for me when I first thought of comps. But then once I thought about it in that way, I was like, oh yeah, if I present my book to that audience, emphasizing the found family aspect, then that might be a pool of readers who would really enjoy it.
Absolutely. That is a super great idea and a great way to use tropes, because that's the same kind. Yep.
Yes.
Nice job.
So I think one of the things that's common about certainly mysteries, maybe thrillers as well, is this idea of misdirection. And that's something that I think is very obviously applicable in other areas. You might want to use misdirection in science fiction, or you might want to use it in romance. You might want to really use it in anything. So specific to that idea of misdirection, are there lessons that non-mystery thriller writers can learn from mysteries and thrillers that they could apply in terms of misdirection?
I was thinking about that recently because this is the 20th anniversary of the Pride and Prejudice with Keira Knightley and Matthew McFadden. And I think that misdirection gets used a lot in that story. And it's something that a lot of people are familiar with. Either you've read the book or, you're probably familiar with the basic concepts. But there is a lot of misdirection in terms of the secrets and the scars in that, in terms of Lizzie's relationship with Darcy and with Wickham, And so I think that's a way of thinking about misdirection without it having to be like a murder mystery or something like that, where there's crime involved, where you're just like, oh, okay, looking at the story one way and getting all this information that supports that. But yet there's this whole other side to it that when you rotate it a little bit, then you're like, oh, I didn't even realize. And I think that's the beauty of misdirection is, really you're in a very strong viewpoint and there's a lot of data to back up that specific way of looking at things. But then later you're doing a reveal either gradually or all at once of, oh, well, there's this other information you didn't know or the character didn't know. And I think that's really the way that you get misdirection. For mystery lovers, Knives Out has a really good example of misdirection. That is probably a recent famous one people would know of. But I do think you see a lot of misdirection in non-mystery and thriller, like I said, with scars and secrets and the slow reveals of why characters are the way they are. So you're basically dealing with motivations and backstory. There's some ways you can share that. And that is actually how they end up using the misdirection in Pride and Prejudice, is the backstory between Darcy and Wickham, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I can imagine that the idea of misdirection could be used in two ways for a love story, let's say. And one would be that you, the author, want the reader to believe that the person is falling in love with one person. In actuality, he or she's falling in love with the other person. But then the other way I could see it could be useful would be in character development. And if you and the reader are both in on what the true situation is, but the character is unaware, then that could be fun because you could just change the plane on which you're applying the misdirection to make it realistic that a character in that situation might be unaware of that aspect of it. So it could be applicable in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of really fun things about misdirection that we don't really talk about a lot, in writing. So it's kind of, it comes across also as hidden identity is another trope, is another way that you could look at for misdirection, like you're talking about. So there's different ways of kind of communicating that idea, but I like thinking about it as misdirection because I feel like it gives me more options for how I'd want to play it out when I just have this general theme of, okay, how am I going to create layers of the story?
Yeah, I think a similar trope that could be used in any genre to support character development would be this idea of scars and secrets that you've mentioned a couple of times. So any recommendations there on lessons that writers of any genre could learn from secret and scars tropes?
Yeah, I think the thing that has taken me a long time to realize is like the more personal to the scar or secret. Obviously, a secret is a thing that you're keeping hidden. And a scar I think of as it may be a secret, but mostly it's a past event that the character is aware that happened and they think they're over it and they're like moving on with their life. But the reader sees that they're not really over it, that it's still very like thinly sealed over and creates a lot of turmoil for them. So those are like the kind of two ways. Sometimes they're the same thing, but they don't have to be the same thing. But what both of them do is create great character motivation in terms of trying to move past them or hide them or not let them control their lives. And that's just why the more I've been doing all the reading and thinking about it, the deeper you can go with those, I think conflict you have embedded in your story. Like the one I keep returning to so amazing is the whole idea of shame. And is there some shame that a character has that they will do anything to prevent coming out, or that they're just not wanting to think about, but it's still driving their behavior? And that's really interesting. I think that's just a really interesting idea to think about, as opposed to something that's maybe more superficial. If you're writing a light romantic comedy, you're going to obviously choose lighter things in terms of scars or secrets. But I think that readers really want deep connections and deep meaning from storytellers. So they will go to these other places if we provide them the structure to do that. Shame is a very common human emotion, and experiencing it in that way through a story can be very cathartic for readers.
Can you think of an example where the author uses that idea of scars or shame effectively? Maybe a movie? Because I think there's more commonality with movie examples sometimes.
Right. Well, I can think of a couple, but one I was thinking of is Longmire. If you've watched that series or read those books, there's the physical scars he has, and then there's all the secrets, what happened. His wife died and all this stuff that he's been dealing with. And then you find out that he actually killed someone for somebody who's supposed to be upholding the law and is very bound by that, something that's really wrestling and tearing him apart. So I think that was a really great through line for the story, for how you were constructing that character, literally wrestling with that all the time. So that's one example. Another one is, I'm a huge fan of Justified. Did you ever see that, Matty? I can't remember.
I did not know.
Yep. I'll have to get you to watch that sometime. Characters in there that both wrestle with shame a lot. The two main characters, one's a U.S. Marshal and then a childhood friend who's basically a criminal, and the whole series is them tracking each other down. There's a whole lot of shame rooted in that. It takes place in a very impoverished area in Tennessee where they were coal miners. So there's a lot of really great shame from that. And then think about Gone Girl, like the rage of Amy, the protagonist, when she finds out that her husband cheated on her. And that is just, she really thought she was different,
Mm-hmm.
And Nick, I think was his name. And just that scene where she goes to visit him at work and sees him kissing the younger woman in the snow. And like he had simulated a similar scene for her when they were dating in New York City. I just thought, oh my gosh, that's so, like, you could just see that just like flipped her over the edge in terms of planning this whole elaborate thing. So I don't know. I just think there's some really cool ways that people have orchestrated stories that are about that without it necessarily being like a character was kept in a box,
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the great example, or the action somebody could take based on the example you were giving from Gone Girl, is this idea that if people encounter that kind of scene that obviously really struck you, the scene that took place in the snow she thought was unique to her, and then she finds out it's not. And if those things really grab you, then think about why it is and how you can apply that. Is there a scene, some reveal in your own story, some like insight you could enable for a particular character that would be reflected by the strength of their reaction to a circumstance that might just go right past another person, but for them is very revealing of those secrets and scars.
Absolutely, yes. And just that whole idea of, she thought their relationship was special and sacred, and they knew, and then that just kind of exploding in that minute for her, I think is something that a lot of people have had that experience with, whether a job or a relationship or something, where you think things are going in one direction, and then all of a sudden things unravel, in a way that you can't control. So I think that was kind of she did it in a very, obviously the planning and all this, the really fun stuff about that story was to a degree that most people are not going to do. But I think the emotion is what behind it was probably something a lot of people could relate with at some level.
Yeah. It would also be interesting because someone writing a scene like that, I can imagine that if you're just you're writing what you're feeling about the story and the characters and not thinking about it deeply. But if you then did step back and take that somewhat more distant look at it, that could reveal what that character really values about her relationship is its uniqueness, perhaps not its depth or its emotional connection or something like that. Like the fact that is what sets her off,
right,
could really be revealing about other parts of that person's character.
Yeah. And you're exactly right, because that was her kind of thesis for the whole thing, where like in the end, when she comes back after that she isn't dead, he didn't kill her, and after she set him up and all that stuff, and she says, I made you with me your best self. And it's kind of interesting in terms of what you would consider best. But you know what I mean? Like this idea of, brings him to a higher level, or he is forced to bring his A game with her, as opposed to like maybe what he's able to get past with other women. And to her, that's what's important. And so it is. So it's a very interesting way to kind of choreograph that. But I think there's a lot. I think that it's an emotion we can find in things if we like look at a story and kind of dig down deep enough, although it might not be like, the Scarlet Letter where it's like, boom, it's in your face, kind of. It's been interesting for me to think about that, at least.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's also an interesting way to think about what about one's book is what is appealing to your readers. So the example that this is making me think of for myself is that I was having a conversation on another episode with Tiffany Yates Martin. And we were talking about, I can't even remember what the topic was, but I realized after 11 novels and 1 novella and 8 short stories that my works very much feature areas that would normally be busy that are not busy. So, for example, a condo building in Ocean City in January,
Oh,
or
yeah.
like lots of places off season.
Yeah,
or
destination or isolation. Oh, that's
yeah,
nice.
exactly. That's what she said. Oh, well, because you're exploring isolation. I was like, yeah,
Yeah. That's
I needed a third party to point that out
right,
to me. But
right.
it's
That's really
a
nice.
theme that I feel like, on the one hand, I think maybe I should stop doing that because maybe it's getting repetitive. But on the other hand, I think, well, if people have enjoyed the other books, perhaps they're liking it because they are as fascinated as I am about what happens there when,
Right.
about that contrast between how a place normally is and then how it is when it's unpopulated. And maybe I should just go with it.
Yeah, I think, I think you've there's a reason why those Scandi-noir stories, which I love, are so popular for the same kind of reason. I mean, you could set those stories in the summer where there's basically 24 hours of sunlight, or you could set it in November, December, January, where it's cold and frozen and dark, but the majority of them are always set in winter. And I think it adds to that feeling, and it's clearly something that resonates with people, that they're interested in. And also the fact that you're really interested in it, I think, is what comes across in the story. If you tried to write some, it can be tricky to try to engineer something. I'm not saying never write to market, but if your heart isn't in it in the same way, it can be very difficult to convey that level of enthusiasm and engagement.
Yeah, it does make me laugh to think about taking one of those Scandi-noir stories and rethink it as being set in Miami, and then taking like a Miami Vice storyline and rethink it being set in.
Right. Oh, which brings me to a kind of a cool anecdote that I liked. Did you ever watch Burn Notice?
No.
Well, it's a really fun spy thriller that I really enjoy. It's probably, I don't know, 15 or it's old now. But anyway, it's about he's like a burned spy. Like he was a spy, but he was turned out by the agency. And so he goes back home to live. And the whole thing is set in Miami. And he's got friends, and it has an 80s feel of a case of the week that he's helping out somebody downtrodden while he's trying to deal with getting back in, and people from his past pop up and stuff like that. But the first iterations of that story were set in New Jersey in winter. And the studio, I don't remember which studios at TBS. I don't remember which. It was a while back when we more had regular stations as opposed to now, or channels. They sent it back when too dark, too grim, set it in Miami. We want more color and light. And it really works in that way. But I was like, oh my gosh, it would have been a completely different story.
Yes.
In Jersey winter,
Yeah.
So
very interesting.
It's really interesting. That was a really interesting, that comment is always stuck in my head because at the time I was not thinking about this stuff so clearly. And I was like, what? How could you do that? But the executives were clearly onto something as a very popular. Yeah, it is really interesting, just the little tweaks and stuff like that. And it had more humorous tone, which you probably, might not necessarily have had in other. But yeah, I love those Scandi-noir things, but they're super dark.
Yeah, you have to alternate them with Miami Vice or whatever the cheerful, colorful thing is that you need you can use as a little break.
I just watched, do you have Netflix these days? I know you tend to take it.
I don't know. I rotate. I can't remember what's active now.
What you got? Okay, yeah. I just watched The Glass Dome, which is a Scandinavian. It's really popular right now, but on Netflix, and it's about a little girl who was stolen and kept in a basically a cage. And there's not any kind of sexual trauma, thankfully, but she escapes. And then this whole story is then as she's older, she's a specialist in, kind of criminal behavior. And then this thing happens again and she becomes involved. And it was really good. And I really enjoyed it. It was an excellent way to spend a weekend day when you're tired and don't want to deal with regular life. But I was also what's about because this is probably the third or fourth Scandi-noir thing I've read with somebody who's kept in a cage. And I'm and I was like, what's that about this? It's just kind of this interesting.
Yeah, you're going to have to add, if it's not already there, you'll have to add trope 41, which is person kept in a cage.
Yeah, kept in a cage. Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about it as a form of Hansel and Gretel, the witch keeping the children in a cage. So, maybe it's because I think a lot of tropes harken back to some of these older these fairy tales. Anyway, but it was just kind of funny. I've never seen other nationality ones, with this whole idea of keeping somebody in a cage. So it was interesting to me. I know the things your brain thinks about when it doesn't work,
Well, I wanted to hit one more trope, which I think is very profitably applied to other genres outside mystery and thriller, and that's the ticking time bomb. So there's obviously the literal ticking time bomb if you're writing a thriller. But talk a little bit about how writers can apply ticking time bomb in other genres.
What I really like about the ticking time, like you say, that it doesn't have to be a literal thing, is that I think about it as any major time-oriented life event. So I think of it as like weddings, funerals, births, moving, job changes, like anything. And when I start to think of it in that way, I see them in different kind of stories. And it's really just a way to kind of make sure the story doesn't languish and that it has to move along because there are some external forces on the story that are making things happen. So I think that's why, like, you see lots of stories that have to deal with an inheritance or going back to a small town or an orphan setting out to try to complete a quest, or where there's a lot of time restrictions built into those kind of things. And so I think it's really helpful in terms of the story not lagging along. When I'm reading a story that doesn't have a ticking time bomb, I'm like, oh, it's tough. Like, what are you doing to make sure that they don't have forever and a day to fix this problem?
Yeah, I found that very much. I mean, I'm a writer of thrillers, but I can almost always improve the pacing, as you're saying, by including some time constraint. And it's usually more realistic with the time constraint. Like, there are just not that many circumstances where whenever is fine.
Yeah, right.
And so it doesn't feel artificial if you have someone who has to achieve a set of actions within they're achieving a certain set of actions, but you're feeling like there's something missing. I think that just thinking through what is a logical time frame, what is the logical ticking time bomb that they could be up against, the logical deadline, and that can be very helpful in terms of keeping things moving along.
And I think like a great example of it that helped me see the importance of ticking time bomb is the really old movie, The Blues Brothers, which, basically could be viewed as just one big long music video because it has so many great performances in it. But if you didn't have that, they had to raise this amount of money and get it to the Cook County assessor's office by this time and this date. It would have been really hard to maintain the tension in that movie, such as it was. So it's kind of one of those things that I was realizing, oh yeah, it doesn't really, there were some explosions in it, but that didn't really have to do with the ticking time bomb itself. Those are like other plot things. But it's just kind of interesting to see. And that's not a thing that I would say as like thriller, I wouldn't think.
Right.
So I think when you kind of look around, there's a lot of things that can be used as ticking time bombs, but just thinking about, what's the impetus on my story to solve the problem?
Yeah.
In a timely manner.
Yeah, I do think that sometimes people overlook these tropes because a trope does get named something like the ticking time bomb. And then if you're writing a romance, you're like, okay, I don't have a bomb, so I'm going to skip over that one without. I think sometimes if the names that had evolved for them were not so specific sounding, then the applicability to different genres might be clearer.
Yeah. But there's so many you could use for romance. Somebody else is coming to town, somebody's leaving for a job. What you're trying to create is urgency. And usually that's a way to do it is... Yeah.
So as you're working on you said that the mystery and thriller trope book is still upcoming, correct?
Yes.
So as you're working on this, are there any sort of overarching themes you're seeing that were a revelation to you as you were going into this research?
Definitely the shame thing. That's been like the thing for me. And I was interested in scars and secrets going into it because I just felt, those just keep popping up again in mystery and thriller and stuff like that. But then when I was thinking like, what are the emotions that connect those? That was really, that's for me has been like, each of the books I discover something that I didn't know about how they work or what their function is. And so for me, that's kind of like been the big revelation so far with that I love those genres. It's a fun one to do. Because I get to, read these different things or watch these different things and think about how they're put together in this way. So they're all fun in certain ways, but this one I'm just enjoying right now working on it. So
cool. Well, Jen, thank you again for another lovely conversation. And please let everyone know where they can go to find out more about you and everything you do online.
Oh yeah, check that. Just at my website, www.jenniferhilt.com. And thanks so much for having me. It's always fun to visit with you.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jen. What's a trope that you love to see in books or movies, regardless of genre? Do you enjoy the found family dynamic, ticking time bomb, or maybe scars and secrets? I would love to hear about it. Just leave a comment on YouTube. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.